Hi everyone, I'm Cody Rue. This is the Church of Logic, and let's jump right back in with Phil Zucker on ordinal analysis, part 2. Beyond the fact that there might be ordinals that are hard to describe and talk about and understand what they mean philosophically, if we take ordinals that have ordinal notations, well, okay, the first thing is that they have to be countable, basically. There's some notion of uncountable ordinal and countable ordinal. I'm not really going to go into that, but basically we're only talking about countable ordinals. And basically an ordinal encodes some notion of termination. Okay, it encodes some notion of like something's going to run in finite time. What's kind of cool is that using these infinite ordinals, you can say encode the termination of a function that takes input and produces output. I came up with this the other day, just as an example. But say you have a function that takes in a number and then prints out, that number minus 1, etc. until it gets to 0, right? So if you pass in 10, it prints out 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Okay. That function is always going to run in finite time, right? Mm-hmm. But how long is it going to run? Well, that depends on the input, right? So the way ordinals are kind of nice is it gives you a way to say that function is going to run in a finite time without talking about inputs and outputs. It just says, hey, if you assign the ordinal omega to this function, then whatever inputs it takes, it's going to run, in less than omega steps. Now imagine you have a function that takes in an input that computes its factorial and then prints out, factorial then minus 1, factorial then minus 2, etc. until 0. Right? So you could say, oh, well, this also runs in omega, right? It takes in an natural number, it's going to run in some finite number of steps because I know that factorial is going to run in some finite number of time, and then the number that it gets, that's a finite number, and it's going to print it in some finite number of steps. Okay, but morally, you don't really want to say, oh, the runtime is factorial, or at least you might want to abstract over that notion, right? You might want to say, okay, I don't want to think about how big factorial is. I just want to be able to say, oh, this is a finite number, and so then printing out that is going to take some finite amount of time that I don't really know. So a very natural thing here would be to say this function, its runtime can be expressed as the ordinal omega plus omega, right? I'm going to have the first omega, and I'm going to use that to describe the runtime of that factorial computation. And then the output of that doesn't matter. It's some finite number. I'm going to use the second omega to represent how much time it's going to take to print that number, right? And so you see that omega plus omega, some crazy infinite, ordinal, but it's useful to talk about the runtimes of programs where I don't want to figure out what the intermediate runtimes of the inside bits are. And you could imagine, right, that I compute the factorial and then I call the factorial again, right? Or something else happens, or it asks for input again. And you can see that all these ordinal combinations are very convenient to abstract away from actually considering the concrete runtimes of the insides. And I think this idea is powerful, and this idea relates ordinals to runtimes of functions that take input and output, or runtimes of functions that don't take any input and output, but that have intermediate state that you really want to ignore. One such function is the Ackermann function. So the Ackermann function is kind of notable for, it calls itself recursively, but it calls itself recursively in arguments you have very little control on, right? The Ackermann function, when it takes inputs n and m, one of its recursive calls might be n minus 1 and the Ackermann function itself on some other inputs. Now, you have no idea what that other argument is. You really don't. But you don't care because the first input went down. And so you're like, okay, well, if the first input goes down, the second input goes to wherever it does. It doesn't matter because the first input is always going to go down, right? And so we have this concept of lexicographic order, right? Where either the first input stays the same and the second input goes down, or the first input goes down and it doesn't matter what the second input does. A very cute way to represent that is the ordinal omega times omega, right? Where omega times omega is going to be bigger than omega times n plus omega times n plus omega times n for any number of pluses. All right? So this lex order is very intuitive, and it's a very finitary notion, right? The first argument goes down, or the first argument stays the same, and the second argument goes down.
Is the analogy you're making here is there's this notion of soft and hard analysis where, in soft analysis, you sort of say like the limit of something goes to zero or I don't know, let's go with just the limit of something goes to zero.
Yeah, sure.
And the limit exists. And in hard analysis, you actually track sort of the rate, or you want to say like exactly how much error there is in some particular thing versus another. And
or
you're sort of
the
taking
intermediate value theorem.
Or the intermediate value theorem.
Right? The function crosses the line somewhere.
And you're sort of taking the ordinals as, like, people are probably more familiar, or at least I'm more familiar with the idea of computational complexity, where this function runs in order n time or n squared time. And you're talking about, well, let's be an even a coarser, softer version of complexity, where I just talk about, termination is a softer version of complexity, where you don't care per se about exactly how long something takes or bounding it in a more precise manner. You just want to know it sort of terminates.
Yes, I think the analogy here is correct. The analogy of analogies, where soft analysis is to hard analysis what ordinals are to runtime complexity of programs.
Mm-hmm.
I do think there's an analogy here, and I think it's correct. So there's a third branch, right? This is really a triangle. It's ordinals, runtimes of functions, and consistency of logics, right? So we've talked about two of those. And the third branch is how do we relate the termination of functions to the consistency? And that's via the Bauer-Hagen-Kolmogorov interpretation that I've also talked about, and cut elimination, and the fact that cut-free proofs are kind of self-evidently consistent, which I think there's a word for that, which I've forgotten. An analytical consistency, or what do they call it? There's this word to describe proofs that are very transparently true. And so if you take the logic, right, and you take natural deduction, say, you use the interpretation of that as programs, you can associate a program to a proof. And if you just look at the proofs themselves, right, in natural deduction, right, where you have, say, if I can prove that A implies B and I can prove that A, then I can prove that B. The associated proofs, right, you're going to have a proof of A implies B and you're going to have proof of A. You could transform conceptually that proof, where you replace, instead of having that, that implication and that A and deducing B, you could say, I just want to directly prove B instead. And every time I need that A somewhere, I'm just going to substitute in that proof of A that I have around. And I might need to do it several times, right? The A implies B might use that A somehow many times. I'm just going to do it, right? And so if you look at these proofs where you've done all these replacements, you end up ending with this very simple notion of proof where you can't ever have these sort of cycles, right? If you're proving an A and B, you must have either A and B in your hypothesis directly, or you have a proof of A and a proof of B, right? Those are the only possibilities. And so these kinds of proofs, you can just examine them, right? And see very clearly that there's no way to build a proof of false if you don't already have a false in your context, right? And people were very excited about this notion, in the early 1900s because, yeah, this is a very reasonable way, right? If you could show that you could take all these proofs with these sort of seemingly irrelevant steps, right? These, I'm going to prove A and B, and then I'm going to get an A out of that. You can turn those into proofs that never do these weird steps, that only prove direct things, right? They must prove an A and B out of an A and a B, and you're never eliminating from proofs and then rebuilding, right? You're just building or you're just eliminating. Rather, you're just building at the top and then eliminating at the bottom. And in some sense, this is a little bit hard to explain in a podcast, I guess, again. But in some sense, those systems where you're only building when you can build and eliminating at the end, those systems are transparently consistent, right? You don't need much to convince you that they're consistent. In particular, as far as Gödel's system applies, right? The machinery of arithmetic is always going to be enough to prove that those systems are consistent. All right? But of course, those systems, it's not obvious that they're enough to actually do all the proofs you want to do, right? So the systems you want to prove to be consistent are not those systems. The systems you want to prove to be consistent are the systems where, maybe I can prove an implication one way, and then I can prove, the left-hand side of that implication, and now I'm going to use that as a lemma, right? The A implies B is a lemma, and you feels like you really need those. But if there was some way to transform those reasonable proofs into the proofs that don't use any of these relevant rules, then basically you'd have a proof of consistency, right? Because you know that latter system is consistent, right? It's obviously, transparently consistent. And you know that you can go from the not obvious thing to the obvious thing. And it turns out that, I think Gensen was the first to observe this, that you can prove using ordinals, right? There's a finite number of steps you can take to go from the complicated system to the simple system. Does this make sense? At least conceptually. The idea of taking the system with cuts or with,
I've never understood why you should want to eliminate cuts at all, since cut is maybe the most natural rule out of any of them, kind of in my mind. It's like if A implies B and B implies C, now A implies C. That is like kind of what cut is saying.
Right. But if you're trying to prove that you can't derive false, right, then surely the more rules you have, the harder it's going to be, right?
Yeah.
Okay. But the system with cut, that system is extra hard to show that it can't prove false, right? Because if that C is false, or 0 equals 1, right, then the system with cut always applies, right? You can always do that cut. It applies anywhere. And there's no real reason why you shouldn't be able to do that and somehow get false, right? You can always introduce some complicated B, and you have no idea what that B is. It could be anything.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I've heard this from a logic programming perspective, or sometimes type class resolution, or like if you are starting with A implies C and you're trying to prove it, okay, now you're going to try and use cut, then you're turning you're like doing this backwards proof search where you're seeking out the theorem A implies C, and then now you have two sub-theorems you need to prove, that A implies B and then B implies C, but B came out of nowhere. That's what you're doing when you're using cut backwards in a goal-driven manner. And it's like, what do you even do with that. But then if you look at the other rules, it's like everything that appears in the other rules of first order logic is what we're talking about, natural deduction. It is more syntax driven than that one. Like you don't need to invent a B for all the other rules. So that is particularly bad about the cut rule.
Yeah, we're kind of being loosey-goosey about exactly what rules you're using. In the Segwit calculus presentation, that is really true. There's no extra magical things that can appear. You can, if you have a for all, then yeah, maybe if your for all is on the left, then yeah, then if you do proof search, you have to find some particular instance of that for all. But that's not so magical, right? That's not too scary. And the cut is really where things are interesting. And certainly a for all isn't going to help you much to find a proof of false.